He thought he could turn her into a joke in front of a packed dining room, but Chef Brandon Hayes had no idea he was about to lose everything in under 10 minutes. The Michelin critic was already seated when Emily Carter walked into the kitchen asking for a job. Her worn jeans drawing smirks as Brandon laughed and handed her his signature dish like a dare, the staff whispering, "Cameras out," waiting for failure. But the moment she touched the ingredients, the noise died, her movements calm. Precise, unfamiliar, and when the plate hit the pass and the critic took a bite, Brandon's smile froze mid-word. He thought humiliating her would entertain the room, but Chef Brandon Hayes had no idea he was about to gamble his entire reputation on a woman he didn't even bother to understand. The dining room of Le Varel shimmered under warm golden lights, crystal glasses catching reflections like quiet applause while the low hum of wealthy conversations filled the air, and just beyond the glass partition the open kitchen stood like a stage where every movement mattered, every plate judged. Especially tonight, because somewhere among the guests sat a Michelin critic no one could identify, a silent observer who could elevate or erase everything Brandon had built over the past 15 years, and Brandon knew it, his crisp white jacket pressed to perfection. His posture sharp, his voice cutting through the kitchen like a blade as he directed his team with practiced authority, until the rhythm broke, until the door creaked open and Emily Carter stepped inside. Her presence so understated it almost felt like a mistake. Her faded denim jacket slightly creased, her sneakers worn from miles of quiet living, her eyes calm in a room that immediately rejected her. A few line cooks glanced over, then back to their stations, dismissing her before she even spoke. But Brandon noticed. He always noticed disruptions, and his eyes narrowed just enough to signal annoyance. "We're not hiring," he said without greeting, his tone flat, already turning away. But Emily didn't leave. She stepped closer, her voice steady, almost too soft for a kitchen that thrived on intensity. "I'm not here for an interview. I just need a chance." And that was when the first smirk appeared. A sous chef let out a quiet chuckle. Another leaned in as if sensing entertainment, and Brandon paused, slowly turning back, studying her now, not as a person but as a distraction. Something out of place in a room designed for precision. His gaze swept from her shoes to her face, calculating, dismissing, deciding, "A chance," he repeated, louder this time, enough for others to hear, enough to shift attention. "You picked the worst night for that," he added, a few cooks exchanging knowing looks, because everyone knew what tonight meant, and yet something about her refusal to step back intrigued him, or maybe it annoyed him more. "Tell you what," he continued, a faint smile forming, not kind, not welcoming, but sharp, performative. "We could use a little entertainment." The word hung in the air as several heads turned, the energy shifting, the kitchen slowing just slightly. "You cook?" he asked, though his tone made it clear he didn't expect much of an answer. Emily met his gaze, steady, unshaken. "Yes," she said simply, and the simplicity of it only fueled the quiet laughter spreading around the room. Someone muttered under their breath, another shook their head. But Brandon raised a hand, silencing them just enough. "Perfect," he said, stepping aside and gesturing toward the central station like he was presenting a stage. "You can make my signature dish." And now even the background noise seemed to pause. Because that wasn't just any dish, it was the one critics came for, the one that defined the restaurant, the one that carried his name, and he knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't giving her a chance, he was setting a trap. A public failure wrapped in false opportunity. "All the ingredients are there," he added, his voice carrying just enough for the nearby staff, and even a few curious diners to catch fragments through the glass. "Take your time. We wouldn't want you to embarrass yourself too quickly." A few quiet laughs slipped out, the kind that echoed more intention than humor, and for a moment Emily just stood there, the weight of every eye pressing in, the heat from the stoves rising, the ticking clock of a full dining room moving forward without her, and then she nodded, just once, no hesitation, no visible doubt, and stepped toward the station, and that was when something subtle shifted, not loud enough to notice at first, but enough to make one of the line cooks glance twice, because instead of rushing, instead of fumbling, Emily reached for the knife with a familiarity that didn't match her appearance, her fingers steady, her posture grounded, and for the first time that night, the laughter didn't grow louder. It started to fade. The first cut of the knife landed with a soft, precise rhythm that did not belong to someone guessing, and a subtle shift moved through the kitchen like a breeze no one wanted to acknowledge. Because confidence like that did not match the story they had already decided about her, Emily Carter did not rush. She did not look around for approval, and she certainly did not react to the quiet tension gathering behind her. Instead, she reached for each ingredient as if she already knew exactly where everything belonged, her fingers brushing over the herbs, selecting without hesitation, adjusting portions without measuring cups, relying on something deeper than instruction, something practiced, and one of the younger line cooks leaned closer, his brow tightening. Because what he saw was not luck, it was control. She is moving too steady, he whispered under his breath, but no one responded, because Chef Brandon Hayes was still watching with that same faint, dismissive smile, arms crossed. Posture relaxed, convinced this was just the slow beginning of an inevitable mistake, yet even he could not ignore the silence that had started to stretch across the room. The usual clatter of pans and shouted commands fading as more eyes drifted toward the center station, drawn by something they could not yet explain, and Emily continued, slicing vegetables into uniform pieces that landed like quiet punctuation on the cutting board, each motion economical, no wasted effort, no second guessing. And when she turned to the stovetop, adjusting the flame with a slight turn of her wrist, the heat responded instantly. Controlled, balanced, and the aroma began to rise, not strong at first, but layered, deliberate, the kind that made people pause without realizing why, and even through the glass partition, a couple seated near the kitchen leaned closer, their conversation slowing as they noticed the change in scent drifting into the dining room, one of them glancing toward the open kitchen with quiet curiosity, because something about that moment felt different, and inside, the sous chef finally stepped forward, just a fraction, as if to get a better look, his earlier amusement gone, replaced by something sharper, something closer to concern. Chef, he said quietly, not loud enough to interrupt, but enough to signal that what they were witnessing might not go the way they expected, and Brandon did not respond immediately, his eyes narrowing slightly now, tracking her movements more carefully, because the mistakes he had anticipated were not appearing. There was no panic, no hesitation, no sign that she was out of her depth, only a steady progression toward something he could not yet define, and Emily reached for the protein, handling it with a respect that suggested familiarity, not fear, seasoning it with a light touch, not overcompensating, not trying to impress, just understanding, and that was the part that unsettled him the most, because real skill did not try to prove itself, it simply existed, and the room felt it, the tension building in a different direction now, no longer waiting for failure, but quietly wondering what would happen next, and for the first time that night, the sound of laughter had completely disappeared, replaced by something far heavier, a silence filled with expectation. And as Emily plated the first component, placing it with careful intention rather than speed, the visual alone made one of the servers stop mid-step, her eyes widening just slightly before she caught herself, because it was not just correct, it was refined, balanced in a way that spoke of experience beyond what anyone in that room had assumed, and Brandon took a slow step closer, not announcing it, not making a scene, but drawn in despite himself, his confidence still present, but now edged with something unfamiliar, something that did not sit comfortably with his certainty, and as the aroma deepened, richer, more complex, weaving through the air with a clarity that demanded attention. Even the backline cooks who had tried to ignore her found themselves turning, watching, measuring every movement with growing disbelief, and Emily did not look up, not once. She did not seek their reactions. She did not acknowledge the shift. She simply continued, as if the outcome had already been decided long before she walked into that kitchen, and in that quiet, controlled moment, something unspoken passed through the room, something that no one could quite name yet, but everyone could feel. The unsettling realization that the story they thought they were watching had already begun to change. The final seconds stretched longer than anyone in that kitchen expected, as if time itself had slowed to watch what Emily Carter was about to complete, and even the distant murmur of the dining room felt muted now. Like the entire restaurant was holding its breath without knowing why, the last element came together under her hands with the same quiet precision that had unsettled everyone from the beginning, a gentle turn of the pan, a controlled reduction. A finishing touch placed not for show, but for balance, and when she finally stepped back, there was no dramatic gesture, no announcement, just a stillness that made the plate speak for itself, and that was when the shift became undeniable, because what sat in front of them was not just acceptable. It was refined, composed, unmistakably deliberate, and the sous chef exhaled slowly, almost as if he had been holding it in for minutes, his eyes moving from the dish to Brandon, waiting for the reaction that would define everything. But Brandon did not speak right away, his gaze fixed on the plate with a focus that had replaced his earlier arrogance, his mind working through what he was seeing, what he was smelling, and more importantly, what he had not expected. Because the structure of the dish was familiar, yes, it followed the outline of his signature creation, but something within it had shifted, something subtle, yet undeniable, an adjustment in proportion, a refinement in technique, a clarity in execution that suggested not imitation but understanding, and that realization pressed against him harder than he was willing to show. And finally, he reached forward, picking up the fork with measured control, aware now that the room was watching him just as closely as they had watched her, every eye fixed on that single moment. The test he had intended to use against her now turned quietly back on him, and when the fork touched the plate, when he took that first bite, the reaction did not come immediately, and that delay spoke louder than anything else could have, because Brandon Hayes was not a man who hesitated, not in his kitchen, not with his food. And yet there he stood, his expression pausing mid-thought, his confidence interrupted by something he could not dismiss, and a faint crease formed between his brows as he processed the flavor, the balance, the unexpected harmony that unfolded with each second, and behind him, the line cooks exchanged quick glances, the silence tightening, the tension no longer rooted in anticipation of failure, but in the unfolding of something far more uncomfortable. The possibility that everything they had assumed was wrong, and even through the glass partition, a figure at a corner table leaned forward slightly, setting down a glass with deliberate care, attention fully captured now. Because the energy had shifted beyond the kitchen, it had reached the dining room, and Emily remained where she was, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, not searching for approval, not reacting to the weight of the moment, as if the outcome had never been in question for her, and that calmness only deepened the contrast. Because Brandon could feel it now, the room waiting, the expectation building around him, pressing for a response he was no longer entirely in control of, and when he finally lowered the fork, the movement slow, deliberate, it was clear that whatever he said next would not just define her place in that kitchen, it would redefine his own, and for the first time that night, the man who had orchestrated the humiliation found himself standing at the center of a silence he did not command, but had to answer. The silence did not break with applause or praise, it lingered, heavy and uncertain, because everyone in that kitchen knew something had just shifted, but no one yet understood what it meant, and Chef Brandon Hayes felt it more than anyone. The weight of expectation pressing against him as he stood there holding the final authority he was no longer fully confident in, his mind replaying the flavors, the balance, the quiet precision of what he had just tasted, searching for a flaw, a reason to dismiss it, but finding none that he could honestly stand behind, and that was the moment his control began to slip, not visibly at first, just a slight tightening of his jaw, a pause that lasted a fraction too long. Enough for those watching to notice that this was no longer the performance he had intended, and behind him the sous chef shifted his stance, no longer relaxed, his eyes fixed on Brandon, waiting, because in kitchens like this, hesitation carried meaning. And Brandon knew it. He felt every second stretching, every unspoken thought gathering around him, and when he finally spoke, his voice was measured, careful in a way it had not been before. "It is acceptable," he said, the words landing flat, controlled, but lacking the certainty that had defined him earlier, and a ripple moved through the staff, subtle but unmistakable, because acceptable was not enough, not for a dish like that, not after what they had just witnessed. And even Brandon seemed to hear it as he spoke. The weakness in the statement, the attempt to regain authority without fully acknowledging the truth, and Emily did not react. She did not smile. She did not argue. She simply stood there, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady. And that steadiness made his words feel even smaller, and then, before the moment could settle, a voice came from beyond the glass, calm, clear, and impossible to ignore. "I would like to try that dish." The words carried across the dining room with quiet authority. And every head turned, the source revealed as a man seated alone at a corner table, his posture composed, his attention unwavering, and in that instant, something clicked across the room, a shared realization moving faster than any spoken confirmation, because there was only one kind of guest who spoke like that, only one kind who commanded that level of attention without raising their voice. And Brandon felt it immediately, the shift from internal pressure to external scrutiny, the realization that the moment he had tried to control had just expanded beyond his reach, and for a brief second, he hesitated again, the decision hanging in the air, whether to deflect, to protect his authority, or to comply and risk everything being exposed, and the room waited, the silence returning but sharper now, edged with anticipation, and finally he nodded once. A small motion that carried more weight than any command he had given that night. "Serve it," he said, his tone steady but quieter, and the plate was lifted, carried with careful hands through the open space, every movement watched, every step echoing in the stillness. And as it reached the table, the man looked down at it with a calm focus that mirrored Emily's earlier composure, no theatrics, no immediate reaction, just observation, understanding, and then he took a bite, and once again, time slowed. The room holding its breath for the second time that night, but this time the stakes were undeniable, and when he finally set his fork down, his expression did not shift dramatically. It did not need to, because the silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was charged, waiting for a single word that would either restore everything Brandon believed he controlled or quietly dismantle it in front of everyone watching, and in that suspended moment, Emily remained exactly where she had been from the start, still, composed, untouched by the rising tension, as if she already knew that what mattered had nothing to do with approval, and everything to do with truth finally being seen. The fork touched the table with a soft, deliberate sound, and in that single motion the entire room seemed to lean forward without moving, because the man at the corner table did not rush his judgment. He did not look around for approval. He simply let the silence deepen until it became impossible to ignore, and then he spoke, his voice calm, measured, carrying just enough to reach the kitchen without effort. "This dish," he began, pausing just long enough for every heartbeat in the room to align with his words, "is not just executed correctly, it understands itself," and the weight of that sentence settled over everyone like a quiet verdict, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, and Brandon Hayes felt it land with a force he could not deflect. Because that was not casual praise, that was recognition, the kind that only came from someone who knew exactly what they were tasting, and around him the staff shifted, not visibly, but internally, their confidence in the hierarchy of the room beginning to fracture. And the man continued, his gaze still on the plate. "There is restraint here, clarity, and an improvement in balance that I did not expect to find tonight," and now there was no mistaking it, the confirmation moving through the space like a quiet shockwave, because improvement did not belong to the original chef, it belonged to the one who had just stepped into the kitchen uninvited, and Brandon's breath slowed, his posture tightening as he absorbed the implication, his mind searching for ground that no longer felt steady, while Emily stood exactly where she had been, her expression unchanged, her presence untouched by the shift she had just caused, and for the first time that evening, all attention moved away from Brandon and settled on her, not with mockery, not with doubt, but with something closer to respect, still forming, still uncertain, but impossible to ignore. And the man at the table finally looked up, his eyes moving toward the kitchen, toward Emily, and when he spoke again, it was not to Brandon, not to the room, but to her who taught you. The question hung in the air, simple, direct, and Emily met his gaze without hesitation, her voice steady, almost quiet enough to miss if the room had not been completely still. No one recently, she said, and there was no pride in it, no attempt to impress, just truth, and that truth carried more weight than any explanation could have, and the man nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something to himself rather than reacting for others, and then he turned back to Brandon, his expression unchanged, but his tone now final. If this is the direction your kitchen is capable of, you would be wise to understand where it came from. And with that, he returned his attention to the dish, leaving the rest of the meaning unspoken, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain, it was settled, the kind that comes when something has been decided without argument, and Brandon stood there. The center of attention he once commanded now shifted entirely, his earlier confidence replaced by a realization he could not avoid. That the moment he had created to diminish someone had instead revealed something far greater than his control, and as he looked at Emily, really looked at her for the first time, the room seemed to fade around them. The noise of the kitchen slowly returning at the edges, hesitant, unsure, as if waiting for his next move, and Emily did not step forward. She did not claim anything, she simply waited, calm, composed, as she had been from the beginning, and in that stillness, the balance of the room had already changed, not through confrontation, not through force, but through something far more difficult to challenge, undeniable skill revealed at exactly the moment it mattered most, and for Brandon Hayes, the realization settled quietly but completely that respect was no longer something he could demand in that room. It was something he had just witnessed being earned without asking for it. The kitchen did not return to normal, not immediately, because something invisible had shifted its foundation, and everyone felt it in the way they moved, the way they spoke, the way they avoided looking directly at Emily Carter as if acknowledging her too quickly would force them to confront how wrong they had been just moments ago, and Chef Brandon Hayes stood at the center of it all, no longer directing the room with effortless authority, but recalibrating in silence, his mind moving faster than his voice, trying to reconcile the image he had created of her with the reality that now stood in front of him, and that gap was not small. It was impossible to ignore, because what she had done was not luck, not coincidence, it was mastery revealed without effort, and mastery did not appear by accident. It was built, refined, lived, and that meant one thing he had not considered before. She had a history he knew nothing about, and that realization unsettled him more than the public shift in perception, because it meant he had misjudged not just her ability but her entire presence, and that kind of mistake did not sit well with someone who built his reputation on control, and finally he stepped forward, closing the distance between them with measured steps, not aggressive, not theatrical, but deliberate. The movement of someone choosing his next words carefully for the first time that night, and when he spoke, his tone had changed, still firm, still carrying authority, but stripped of the earlier edge that had fueled the room's tension. "You said no one taught you recently," he began, his eyes searching her face now. With genuine focus rather than dismissal, that means someone did, and the kitchen listened, not openly, but in the subtle way their movement slowed, their attention drifting back to the center without breaking their tasks, and Emily met his gaze again. Steady as before, her calm unchanged by the shift in tone. "A long time ago," she replied, her voice even, and there was something in that answer that suggested more than she was willing to say. Not secrecy, but selectivity, as if her past was not something she needed to explain to earn a place in the present, and Brandon nodded slightly, absorbing that, understanding that pressing further would not give him control, not in this moment, and for a brief second the room balanced between two possibilities. One where he doubled down, reclaimed authority through dismissal, and another where he acknowledged what had just happened and adapted, and that choice defined more than just his leadership. It defined the kind of man he was in that kitchen, and the seconds stretched as everyone waited, even if they pretended not to, and then he turned slightly, looking toward the pass where the dish had been sent out, then back at her, and when he spoke again, the words were simple, but they carried a weight no one had expected from him that night. "Make it again," he said, not as a challenge this time, not as a test designed to fail, but as a request that acknowledged what he had seen without fully surrendering his position, and the subtle shift in intention did not go unnoticed, not by the staff, not by the servers, and certainly not by Emily, who paused just long enough to register the difference, and then nodded once, the same calm acceptance she had shown from the beginning, stepping back to the station without hesitation, and this time the room did not laugh, no one whispered, no one smirked, because the context had changed, the expectation had transformed. And what they were about to witness was no longer entertainment, it was confirmation, and as Emily reached for the ingredients again, the movements felt familiar yet deeper, not proving anything, not reacting to pressure, but simply repeating what she already knew. And Brandon remained where he was, watching not as a critic looking for flaws, but as a professional trying to understand something he had not anticipated, and in that quiet repetition, the kitchen began to realign itself, not back to what it was before, but toward something new, something unspoken, where respect was no longer assumed based on titles or appearances, but recalculated based on what had just been revealed. And as the second dish began to take form, the silence returned, not heavy this time, but focused, the kind that comes when a room finally understands that it is witnessing something real. The second time felt different from the very first movement, not because Emily Carter changed what she was doing, but because everyone else had, the room now watching with intention rather than expectation of failure. And that shift gave weight to every motion she made, every decision she executed without hesitation, and as she reached once again for the ingredients, there was no rush, no need to prove anything beyond what already existed, her hands steady, her posture grounded, her focus unbroken by the presence of Chef Brandon Hayes standing only a few feet away, observing not as a man seeking control, but as one searching for understanding, and the kitchen adjusted around her, not dramatically, not all at once, but in subtle ways that revealed more than words ever could, a line cook clearing space without being asked, a server pausing at the edge of the station just to watch for a moment longer than necessary, even the sous chef stepping back slightly, creating room not out of instruction but recognition, and that recognition carried a quiet respect that had not been there before, and Emily moved through the process with the same calm precision, but now the details became clearer to those paying attention, the slight adjustment of seasoning before the heat was applied, the careful timing of each component so that nothing competed for attention on the plate, the way she balanced textures without overcomplicating the dish, and Brandon noticed all of it, his eyes tracking each step, his mind connecting the techniques to knowledge he knew could not be improvised. This was not someone repeating a recipe. This was someone who understood the foundation deeply enough to reshape it without breaking it, and that realization settled into him with a weight that was difficult to ignore. Because it meant the hierarchy he had relied on was not as absolute as he believed, and for a moment, his attention drifted beyond the immediate, considering the years behind her, the experience she carried without display, the reasons she would walk into a place like this without announcing who she was, and those questions lingered unanswered as the dish continued to take form, and once again the aroma began to build, richer this time, more defined, as if the kitchen itself was responding differently. No longer filled with doubt, but with a quiet anticipation that no one spoke aloud, and the rhythm of the room aligned with hers, the background noise lowering naturally, conversation softening, movements sinking into a subtle harmony that had not existed before. She arrived, and when she reached the final steps, there was no dramatic pause, no shift in pace, just a continuation of the same steady control that had guided her from the beginning, and the plating reflected that control, each element placed with intention, nothing excessive, nothing missing, a composition that felt complete without needing to explain itself. And as she stepped back once more, the silence that followed was different from before. It was not tense. It was not uncertain, it was settled, as if the room had already accepted what they were about to witness again, and Brandon exhaled slowly, not out of pressure, but out of clarity, his earlier doubts replaced by a recognition he could no longer deny. And this time, when he stepped forward, there was no hesitation in his movement, no performance in his posture, just a directness that carried a new kind of authority, one shaped not by dominance, but by acknowledgment. And he took the fork again, the room watching just as closely as before, but now the energy had changed, no one waiting for him to validate the dish, but rather to confirm what they already believed, and as he tasted it, the reaction came quicker. Not because the dish was simpler, but because the truth no longer needed time to reveal itself, and he nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but one that carried more meaning than any words he had spoken that night. And when he looked at Emily, the expression in his eyes had shifted completely, no trace of mockery, no hint of dismissal, only a quiet respect that had been earned in a way no title could grant. And in that moment, the kitchen understood something that would not be forgotten, that skill revealed under pressure was not just impressive, it was undeniable, and that denial, once broken, did not return. The nod from Chef Brandon Hayes did not echo loudly, but it carried through the kitchen with a clarity that no one could ignore, because in a place where words were often sharp and immediate, a silent acknowledgment meant far more than praise. And for a brief moment no one moved, as if the entire room needed time to adjust to what had just been confirmed, and then slowly, almost cautiously, the rhythm of the kitchen began to return, but it was not the same rhythm as before. It had changed. Softened at the edges, more aware, more deliberate, and Emily Carter stood at the center of that shift without claiming it, without reacting to it, simply wiping her hands on a clean towel and stepping slightly back from the station as if her role in the moment had already been fulfilled, and that quiet detachment made the impact even stronger. Because she was not seeking recognition, she had never been, and that absence of need only reinforced what everyone had just witnessed, that her skill existed independently of their approval, and Brandon understood that now in a way he had not before, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer, not searching for flaws anymore, but for context, for understanding, for anything that could explain how someone like her had walked into his kitchen unnoticed and revealed something his entire team had not expected. And before he could speak again, the man at the corner table stood up, his chair sliding back with a soft, controlled motion that immediately drew attention once more, and as he walked toward the open kitchen, there was no rush in his steps, no need to assert authority, because it was already present in the way the room adjusted to his movement, servers stepping aside, conversations lowering, and when he reached the pass, he paused, looking first at the dish that had just been prepared again, then at Emily, his expression calm but intent, as if measuring something beyond the obvious, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same quiet certainty as before. "Consistency is where most people fail," he said, not as a critique but as a statement of fact, and Emily met his gaze, her posture unchanged, her calm intact. "Consistency comes from understanding, not repetition," she replied, her voice steady. And that answer settled into the space between them with a weight that did not need elaboration, and the man gave a slight nod, acknowledging not just the words, but the truth behind them, and then he turned slightly toward Brandon, his presence now bridging the two. "You have something rare in your kitchen tonight," he said, his tone even, but unmistakably serious. "The question is whether you recognize it before it walks away," and that sentence did not linger long, it did not need to, because its meaning was immediate and clear, and for the first time since the night began, Brandon did not respond right away, not because he lacked an answer, but because he understood the gravity of what was being said, and more importantly, the opportunity within it. And as the man stepped back, returning to his table without further comment, the focus shifted once again to Brandon and Emily, the room subtly leaning into that moment, waiting, not for a command, but for a decision, and Brandon took a slow breath. His posture straightening, not in defense, but in clarity, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a new tone, still authoritative, but grounded in something deeper, something earned rather than assumed. "Where did you learn to cook like that?" he asked. Not as a challenge, not as a test, but as a genuine question, and Emily paused for the first time, just briefly, as if deciding how much of her story belonged in that room, and then she answered simply, "In places where mistakes mattered." And the weight of that answer lingered, hinting at a past that shaped her skill without needing to define it, and the kitchen fell quiet again, not with tension this time, but with respect. As if everyone understood that they were standing at the edge of something they had not anticipated, something that had quietly redefined the space without asking permission, and in that moment, the hierarchy that once felt fixed had shifted into something more honest, where titles no longer guaranteed authority, and silence no longer meant weakness, and as Brandon looked at her, truly seeing her now, the realization settled in fully, that what stood in front of him was not just talent, but experience shaped by something far beyond the walls of his kitchen, and that kind of presence did not arrive by chance, it arrived with purpose, whether spoken or not.